Welcome back to Lost in History, a video series examining the history of Indigenous affairs in Canada. In this video, we're examining the Royal Proclamation of 1763, one of the foundational documents in the Crown-Indigenous relationship. For over 250 years, the Royal Proclamation has been at the center of the relationships between First Nations and newcomers in Canada, although not everyone agrees on its significance. For many First Nations leaders, the proclamation does several things. It's a recognition of Indigenous rights, a recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, and a guide for the ongoing Crown-Indigenous relationship. But for the Government of Canada, it's more of a document establishing British authority and setting out the treaty-making process. Let's have a look. When the French established their colonies, they were quick to form alliances with the original inhabitants near them. In the Maritimes, they formed alliances with the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet, and in the St. Lawrence Valley with the Innu, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron peoples. For their part, the Dutch and the British established their colonies along the Atlantic coast, and they famously built trade relationships with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy amongst other First Nations. These alliances were built on a new way of interacting, a so-called forest diplomacy. It used both European and First Nations protocols like the signing of documents and the exchange of wampum. Using the long-established Indigenous trade routes, the French and the British built a network of fur trade posts. These posts helped Europeans claim ownership over the lands of North America, all with little regard to the rights of First Nations. These alliances, however, were more than just for trade. They were also important aspects of the military and defensive needs of French and British colonizers. The colonies were often pawns in France and Britain's aspirations of world empire, and colonial administrators needed First Nations warriors to help defend the huge territories they were claiming. The British were very reliant on their primary alliance with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who were seen as a buffer against New France. This alliance was known as the Covenant Chain. It was described as a symbolic silver chain that bound the British to the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee, and it was supposed to be built on mutual respect and non-interference. The Covenant Chain was constantly being re-examined, either to make sure that it was still beneficial to both parties or to address any outstanding grievances. This was a process known as polishing the Covenant Chain. Despite its built-in dispute resolution mechanism, colonies were constantly violating the Covenant Chain, and the alliance weakened over the years. Just as the 7 Years' War with France was starting, the British needed to renew the Covenant Chain. In 1755, William Johnson was appointed superintendent of the Indian Department. His mission was to repair these broken relationships. Johnson was a fur trader with strong connections to the Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. He knew that the alliance had been damaged by the way the colonies had encroached onto Indigenous lands, and that this was disrupting the traditional land usage and harming the well-being of First Nations. Johnson had a reputation for fairness in his dealing with Indigenous peoples, and he used his connections with the Mohawk to polish the Covenant Chain with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and with the other First Nations of the Ohio Valley. After renewing these alliances, First Nations warriors were ready to support the British military, and they were often a deciding factor in key British victories. The 7 Years' War stretched across eastern North America and around the world. It came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. As a result, France ceded nearly all of its North American colonies, leaving Britain as the primary European power throughout much of North America. With no European competition left, officials in London wanted to demonstrate British authority in North America. As a result, King George III issued a proclamation on the 7th of October 1763 to announce a new administration of British North America. It also wanted to clarify Britain's relationship with First Nations. Let's break down what it says. The proclamation has three significant parts. First, it laid out how British possessions in North America would be managed. It set the Appalachian Mountains as a hard western border for the American colonies, and it established a governor for a new colony, the province of Quebec, that covered the French settlements of the St. Lawrence Valley. Secondly, it stated that the lands to the west of the colonies were to be Indian territories. In these territories, no settlers were allowed, and the Indian Department would be the primary intermediary between settlers and First Nations. Finally, the proclamation wanted to prevent shady land purchases that were damaging relations with First Nations. so it prohibited all colonial governors from concluding any treaties with First Nations. It then set out protocols and procedures to be used when acquiring First Nations lands. In effect, the proclamation was a form of recognition of Indigenous rights over these lands. Sir William Johnson got news of the Royal Proclamation in December 1763. He had copies made and sent out to the First Nations throughout the interior of North America. He also wanted First Nations leaders to meet with him at Fort Niagara in July 1764. For their part, First Nations were anxious to meet with Johnson. They wanted the fur trade to resume, as the fighting of the 7 Years' War had ended 3 years earlier. They were also very unhappy that the British were occupying the former French fur trade posts in the interior. Johnson was hoping that the terms of the Royal Proclamation would reassure First Nations that trade would soon start again. But he also wanted to use the proclamation to inform First Nations that the British were there to stay. To do so, Johnson was going to have to establish new diplomatic relations with them. His diplomatic plan had two goals. First, he wanted to renew the covenant chain with allies, such as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And secondly, he wanted to bring the former First Nations allies of New France into an alliance by extending the covenant chain to them. When First Nations leaders arrived at Fort Niagara, they met with Johnson individually, who tried to address their specific grievances. He then held a conference with all leaders where he presented the terms of the Royal Proclamation itself. He promised that trade was going to start soon now that the colonies had been reorganized. Using forest diplomacy, he renewed the covenant chain with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and then extended it to all other First Nations. Johnson knew that he had to maintain the respect of Indigenous leaders. He did so by honoring their diplomatic protocols and by recognizing how First Nations understood their relationship with the British Crown. For First Nations, this meant that the conference at Niagara in 1764 was a binding treaty on the British. The proclamation was to put a halt to the uncontrolled spread of the colonies into Indigenous territories. But it also had clauses that allowed for new lands to be opened up for colonization. It created a so-called proclamation line between the colonies and the Indian territories. The proclamation then set out the rules to allow colonies to grow and prevent fraudulent treaties. It stated that individuals couldn't buy land from First Nations, only the representatives of the Crown could do that. Treaty negotiations also had to be done in a public meeting of the First Nations who had interests over the lands to be purchased. While these protocols changed the way treaties were being concluded in North America, they did not necessarily reflect First Nations perspectives or understandings of the treaty-making process. Once these treaties were concluded, official settlement would be permitted in the areas covered by the agreements. In Upper Canada, agents of the Indian Department and First Nations negotiated more than 30 land cessions between 1764 and 1862. The protocols set out by the Royal Proclamation guided all future treaties in Canada, such as the Robinson Treaties during the late colonial period, the numbered treaties during Canada's western expansion, and today with the comprehensive land claim agreements. The treaties concluded over the last 250 years have not always seen the attention they deserve. Government officials have often chosen more to focus on policies of assimilation instead of the relationships created by these treaties. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the conference organized by Sir William Johnson at Fort Niagara the following year are some of the earliest recognitions of First Nations rights. Despite this long-standing recognition, Indigenous peoples in Canada have had to continuously push to have those rights protected. When the Constitution Act was repatriated in 1982, Section 25 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms stated that nothing in it would invalidate the rights of Indigenous peoples recognized by the Royal Proclamation. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is more than just a declaration of the British Crown's authority over its colonies after a conflict. It recognized rights, it established protocols that eased interactions between Indigenous peoples and newcomers, and it continues to be one of the foundational documents in the evolving Crown-Indigenous relationship in Canada. For more information on the history of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, please see the links in the description below. Thanks for watching, see you in the next one.